So where is it that we go from here? Well, what I want to do today is just make a few points, and in order to do that, I want to define reading in the way that I define it and we define it in our work collectively so that we can really be more specific and more precise as we move forward in this work. So if we take this fifth grade passage about high-speed trains, there are all kinds of skills that you and I engage in. We tap our own skills and competencies to get through this. And what I want to point out is we think about those skills really in two domains, and that helps to guide our work 0 to 8 to develop strong and healthy individuals. So if we take this passage, very briefly, there are word level skills that we need, right? We know the word pattern that goes with the word high is part of a family, right? The words sigh and thigh, and we understand that pattern, and we pronounce it in a way that is different from how it might look if we took it at face value. We know that to get through the word speed, what we actually do, if that word were unfamiliar to us as readers, is we would break it apart into 4 different sounds and then put it back together again and quote-unquote read it as speed. We know that the 5th grader needs to get through this passage reading at about 115 words correct per minute in order to have the space or the room left over to make meaning of it, which is to say, we have to get through it quickly enough in order to be able to actually think about what we're reading. So if you imagine yourself, you sit down with the newspaper, your mind wanders, and you say to yourself, I've got to go back to the beginning to really make sense of this again. I didn't get through it quickly enough to be processing it at the same time. And once you do that, when you're doing that kind of processing, there are all kinds of other skills and competencies that you're bringing into this. You know the way in which service is used, in this case, a passenger service on a train as different from service at the restaurant, right? There are 14, in fact, different entries for the word service. So we know that in text, a lot of words are used with slightly different meanings than we tend to use day to day in conversation. You have to bring enough information and knowledge about trains to even get something from this passage. You wouldn't learn about trains just by reading this. You'd have to be interested and motivated to get through it. You've got to be at some level engaged in this, and we've all certainly today even come across pieces of information and text that we're more interested in than others, and some of that has to do with how much we know about the topic. And you'd have to have lots of different strategies to better understand it if, in fact, you didn't really understand it at the first pass. So when you do that, what I want to push on is that you are engaging two different sets of skills. On the mechanics side, we call them skills-based competencies, which is to say, having that word family and having the ability to break out that word speed into its different sounds and having the skills to read it at 115 words per minute, we think of as really the mechanics of reading. There are 26 letters and 44 sounds, and they're mastery-oriented. Usually about by the end of 2nd grade, students have these skills down pat. The great majority of students develop their word-level reading skills, the ability to read print on the page, usually by the end of 2nd grade or so. On the other side, the knowledge-based competencies are the competencies that we start developing at birth, in fact, because, of course, our language and our vocabulary and our knowledge about the world starts building up really from infancy. And they have to develop all the way up through adolescence if we're going to keep pace with the way in which language and reading becomes more complex over time. And what I really want to push on as Terry and her team at Read On Arizona continue to do their work is that we want to be very clear that today, when we look at the populations that we are most concerned about, we are doing a good job developing their skills-based competencies. They are mastering, in many cases, the mechanics of reading, the how to read the words on the page. But if you look at these data here, following a national study that we conducted for 10 years, following a sample of about 300 families, we recruited them from Head Start preschools. We looked at their literacy development from age 4 to age 14. We collectively, the system, and we can, I'm willing to say we because we're all a part of this, but this is a group of 300 students who went off into high school, 9th grade, with vocabulary and reading comprehension levels at the 20th percentile. Up through the system, right? Enrolled in preschools, attendance looks good. They got there, they were there. Parents imagined that things were going very well because they hadn't necessarily heard about bad performance. They didn't really have great information about their academic achievement. But what we're getting is this huge gap between their ability to read the words on the page and really make meaning from text, and therefore engage in good reading and writing and listening and speaking. That's really knowledge-based. That's about how they come to build up enough knowledge about the world to make sense of print. So when I teach this finding with our group of reading specialists every year in our master's program, what I say is it's actually not unlike if one of us were to enroll in a graduate level seminar in a field of study that we'd never been exposed to before. So I could go over to the biochemistry department and I could read the words on the page. I have the mechanical skills, but I don't bring enough knowledge to the page in order to be at grade level. I'm going to get something out of that text because I'm there, I've been there, and these students have been there in schools, in their classrooms, all the way up through the system. But they haven't accumulated enough knowledge, and in this case, academic vocabulary, to really make sense of what they're reading. And when we think about the way in which we deliver the curriculum in high school, statistically, the odds are against most of these students when we think about high school graduation. They are very unlikely to independently handle the text demands of high school, despite being up through the system. When we replicate this study on the West Coast in the San Diego Unified District, we get exactly the same finding. When we look at national data, we get exactly the same finding. What I want to be clear about very briefly is if you look at the numbers that compare their rates of growth to the rates of growth that were expected for them based on the national test, you actually see, what do you see? Higher rates of growth for the sample we studied than for the national average. Higher rates of growth. So what this highlights is the difference between growth and performance. These children were actually learning at higher rates than what we would have expected from them along the way. The problem is it wasn't high enough to catch up and make up the gains, right? So I think about my own to-do list. I feel like I get a lot done every day and every week, but it's never quite enough to catch up and get ahead, right? It's the same idea. These are students who are learning 2 words for every 1 word their native English-speaking peer is learning. The problem is it wasn't enough to get them where they needed to go. I should say their native English-speaking peer probably from a nationally representative sample would put them in the middle class bucket. And when we do this comparison and take these data and replicate them on the West Coast and make a comparison between our language minority learners, our English language learners, and their native English-speaking peers, you will see that, in fact, the difference by the time we're into middle school, these are 6th grade data, the difference is really not a meaningful difference, which is to say what we're really talking about is building up the knowledge-based competencies in our at-risk populations in ways that's really going to meaningfully get them to where they need to go. So we see that same gap between the 2 groups, between their mechanical skills or their skills-based competencies and their knowledge-based competencies over time. And these are, again, a sample educated up through the system of native English speakers. But once we're into urban districts, we may not need to make quite the distinctions that we're making, and we may be thinking more about knowledge-based skills and competencies in the overall population.